Let's go to the next part, discussing about anatomy of prefrontal cortex with a specific fMRI task. So now we are trying to explore that in the methods that we have been discussing about before in terms of fMRI, and using those methods to be able to explore prefrontal cortex functions and have a kind of a sense about the pragmatic assessment of how prefrontal cortex could get engaged in these processes. We are going to have a simple fMRI task that we give people one stimuli, which is going to be a face, and then we give them two stimuli in over a time of like 20 seconds later, and they are supposed to tell which one they have seen before. Let's say they have seen this one but not this one, and they are supposed to tell us which one has been kind of presented before. So that is a classic sort of visual working memory task, and how the brain is going to respond to this process. So that is what we are going to explore. And it seems that we have different areas in the brain involved in this task. I should say almost every single part of the brain could have a role for this task. I'm going to discuss about the role of these parts. Obviously, those parts which are in yellow, they are located in the medial side or aspect of the brain. Things like supplementary motor area or fusiform gyrus. So they are located on the kind of medial side, and that's the reason that they are being labeled as yellow to be able to be discriminated from the areas that are in front or in outer side of the brain. Okay, let's go and see how different parts of the brain could get engaged in this task. As far as we show them the subjects, the figure, obviously we'll have an activation in visual cortex because of seeing this. And then just few milliseconds after pathing from the initial presentation of the visual stimuli, we have activations in areas, as we discussed, inferior temporal, fusiform areas, those areas that are keeping the information in collaboration with the areas that we have in terms of, let's say, medial frontal gyrus and anterior cingulate cortex. So they are keeping the information that we collected here. And they keep remaining active here. As you can see here, they are still active over the process of moving through these 20 seconds of delay to the question that we are going to get in the next part. And as soon as we get the question, now we need to respond and say and get, let's say, supplementary motor areas and some motor parts of the brain. So these are the motor parts of the brain, and the supplementary motor area and cingulate gyrus, getting them involved and receiving the response and doing the response. And afterwards, we have a remaining activity in anterior cingulate cortex and orbital cortex, because of basically the feeling of being successful or non-successful in responding to that. So having a sort of a conflict resolution and also a reward evaluation afterwards when you do this task with or without success. That's a really beautiful representation of how a visual stimuli could be processed and be retained in the system for a while, and keeping that as something like a map, a representation map for a while in both your prefrontal, your visual areas in terms of, let's say, fusiform gyrus and temporal gyrus. And meanwhile, you still have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex with you. Why? Because you are going to use this in the future as well. So this is why the prefrontal cortex is involved, because this map is gonna remain there, and we are gonna use that for the next step to be able to answer to a question. And that is the reason that we have, let's say, this part of the brain being engaged and remain active as much as we get to the point to have the response. It's quite amazing to have some specific activations afterwards, and what do they mean in terms of the feeling and the kind of conclusion that we have in terms of our performance to find or not finding the answer that we are expected to provide. So this is how brain imaging could give us a sense about sort of temporal dynamics of this process, from, let's say, simple representation of visual stimuli to the visual cortex, and then going that through the process of working memory and responses to the working memory task. This is what we have seen together in terms of moving from posterior part, getting involved in the anterior part, and then remaining in the anterior part afterwards. And it is interesting if you present people with auditory stimuli. So if we give them, this is the auditory response, and then you are supposed to keep that in your mind, and then just, let's say that what was that auditory stimuli was about. And the process is going to be the same. The only major difference is that instead of having the visual cortex involved, we had the auditory cortex involved, and keeping that information in the auditory cortex as far as we are gonna to use the information. Meanwhile, we have lots of activation in the prefrontal cortex, because we are going to use this information in the future in a working memory task. The other part about the important aspect of whatever we are doing in terms of the prefrontal cortex is that when we practice something and we develop a sort of skill for something, then we do not have very much activation in the prefrontal cortex. So whatever we are doing as something like a habitual behavior, there is no need for a futuristic prospective cognition for that, because technically we know what is going to happen. And we can just use whatever we have in terms of the neural networks in the brain that we train to do that specific task without getting the prefrontal cortex involved when we have been planning and thinking about what are the consequences and what is going to happen afterwards in the naive space. But when we are practice, there is no technically futuristic cognition that we need to get involved in the process of doing the task, because we already know what is going to happen in the future, and we have already developed habitual behaviors to be able to do that. And when we are experienced, when we are exposed to novel environments, we have the prefrontal cortex to get activated again and be involved in this process. And there are people who, when they get practiced, they just avoid to get into the novel environment, and probably the reason is they need to bring back their prefrontal cortex. And as I told you, prefrontal cortex functions are also associated with what we call mental effort and fatigue. So what we have in terms of the effort and fatigue, or feeling of pressure, they are all related to PFC. And that is the reason that sometimes there are people who are avoiding whatever that is going to be novel, because they need to bring back the PFC functions. Okay. One other aspect of what we are doing in terms of engaging prefrontal cortex is discussing about whatever we have in another part of prefrontal cortex, which is a really interesting part of the prefrontal cortex, and we discussed about that before in terms of what we call anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. What is important about ACC which is going to be really important for PFC as other parts of PFC as well. I will get to that point as well through the session today, is that the ACC is divided into cognitive and affective divisions. And the dorsal ACC part is involved in cognitive sides, and the affective side would be related to what we call subgenual ACC, or what we call rostral ACC. Okay? And why do we call that subgenual? Because we have corpus callosum that we discussed about before, and this part is something like genu, or something like knee. And is it because under this genu or knee part, we call that subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. So it is divided to cognitive and affective. So the posterior part are more, or dorsal part is more cognitive, and the lower part are more affective. And what does it mean for other parts of the prefrontal cortex? We have the same issues in terms of if we are going to have a futuristic, purely motor plan, like what we had with Tower of London task, that is going to be represented in what we call dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But if we are going to have a futuristic representation of actions that are associated with emotions, rewards, punishments, then it is not going to be reflected in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It is going to be reflected in ventromedial part of the prefrontal cortex. I will get back that point as well. So those futuristic mental representations could also be divided into cognitive and affective or motivational parts. And they can have different parts of the brain involved in these futuristic cognition, whether it's just going to be purely cognitive and planning and motor, or whether they have implications of risk, reward, punishment, whatever that is going to make an effective contribution to our life. They have different areas in the brain to be represented. I will discuss about that in the later kind of parts as well. The other interesting part about, let's say, anterior cingulate cortex is that when we have these cognitive tasks, when we have a cognitive task that are represented by by red dots or small circles, they make the activations in the affective division. So it's something like when we have the cognitive division activated, the affective part would be deactivated. And these are just the summary of different studies that people have done. And each of these, let's say, circles represented a single study that somebody has done. So this is how most of the studies are just reporting their activation map. People are not very much interested to report their deactivation maps. And this is exactly the discussion right now that we have with a group of colleagues who are doing a data analysis. I'm not sure if Amir Hossein Dakhili is online right now. Amir Hossein, we had exactly the discussion last week in terms of why some of those people, we have a kind of a group of people, we are doing the same data analysis on one single kind of database, and some of the people were just reporting the activations, not the activations. And I think that I'm not so sure if Sarah Jafakesh is online right now. Sarah was showing us both activations and deactivations. So most of the people are in the fMRI field, they just report the activations. But it's also important to report deactivations. But most of the time, people do not report the deactivations. And deactivations are as important as activations. As you can see here, those few limited studies that reported deactivations, they show that they have deactivations for cognitive tasks in the subgenual part, and then deactivations of the affective task in the dorsal anterior cingulate parts, and that is also interesting as well. And then we have two parts discussing about, let's say, prefrontal cortex lesions and clinical implications and how these things are going to be important.